There's a common story told, usually late at night over lukewarm coffee or a cold beer, about the ones who made it. The lucky ones. The ones who got the break, caught the right wind, or had a rich uncle with a leg up. And most folks, they listen to that story, nod their heads, and decide their own ship just wasn't meant to sail that far. They figure success is something that happens to you, not something you build brick by heavy brick with your own two hands. They ain't wrong about luck, not entirely. But they're missing a chapter, a deeper truth about the kind of luck you forge yourself in the quiet hours when no one's watching. Garrett used to tell himself that story too, not out loud, mind you. Garrett wasn't one for talking much, especially about himself. He was the kind of man who communicated with the tilt of his head, the set of his jaw, or the steady, knowing glint in eyes that had seen more metal than most folks ever would. His words were like the tools on his bench, each one chosen for a specific purpose, no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish. 42 years old, Garrett was a mechanic, not the kind who hooked up a laptop, read a code, and hit a reset button. He was the kind who listened to an engine cough and wheeze, felt the vibration through a wrench as it bit into rusted metal, smelled the oil and burning rubber, and knew exactly where the problem lay, deep in the guts of the machine. He had a way of looking at a seized bolt, a fouled spark plug, or a rattling piston that made you think he was having a silent conversation with it, coaxing its secrets out. His hands were his livelihood, thick and powerful, permanently stained with grease and grime that even the strongest industrial soap couldn't truly scrub away. The skin around his knuckles was perpetually cracked, little canyons etched by years of gripping, twisting, and prying. These weren't the delicate hands of a surgeon, but they were precise in their own way, capable of resurrecting what others had given up for dead. When he reached for a tool, his movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, betraying a meticulous attention to detail that went beyond mere competence. He could spend an hour just cleaning threads on a bolt, knowing that sloppiness now meant failure later. His face was etched with the silent testament of his trade and his life. Lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes, not from smiling much, but from squinting into dark engine bays and the unforgiving glare of shop lights. A scar, thin and white, ran across his left eyebrow from a childhood bike accident, giving him a perpetually slightly furrowed brow. He carried the faint but persistent scent of oil and gasoline, a smell that clung to his work clothes even after washing, a second skin of his profession. Garrett's gaze was usually directed downwards, at the intricate mechanisms beneath a hood or at the worn concrete floor of the shop. But when he did lift his eyes to meet yours, they were a surprising shade of deep hazel, clear and remarkably observant, taking in more than he ever let on. He didn't offer a quick smile or an easy laugh. Those had to be earned like the trust of a stubborn engine. But once you had it, once he gave you that slow, knowing nod, you knew he was dependable, honest to the core, and utterly committed to the task at hand. He was the first one in the shop most mornings, the last to leave, his silent presence a cornerstone in a world always on the brink of breaking down. He didn't grandstand, he just fixed things. And that, most folks figured, was just who Garrett was, a good, honest mechanic. Nothing more, nothing less. There's a quiet hum to the world if you listen close enough. Not the roar of the highway or the chatter of the news, but the steady thrum of honest work, of hands calloused and backs bent. They say fortune favors the bold, but truth be told, fortune often just nods its head to the persistent. To the ones who show up day in, day out, long before the sun cracks the horizon, or long after it's dipped below. Not for applause, not for a medal, but because something deep inside them just won't let them quit. They're building something, brick by quiet brick, even when no one's watching. These are the unsung architects of their own future, chipping away at the impossible, one boring, consistent swing of the hammer at a time. There are men like that in every town, every shop, every dusty corner of this world. Men who look ordinary, live ordinary lives, but carry an uncommon fire, a silent resolve that burns steadier than any spotlight. This is a story about one of them. This is a story about Garrett, 42 years old and a mechanic by trade in a town that still believed in fixing things instead of just throwing them out. He wasn't the kind of man to make a grand entrance, or even much of a sound beyond the clang of steel on steel. If you tried to describe him, you might say solid. He was like an old oak, rooted deep, weathered but unyielding. His presence was more felt than heard, a quiet anchor in a world always seeming to spin too fast. Most mornings, you'd find him hunched over an engine, his hands permanently stained. With oil and grease, always smelled faintly of gasoline and sweat, moved with the practiced ease of someone who knew the exact angle to turn a wrench, the perfect torque needed to tighten a bolt without stripping it. They were hands that built, repaired, and kept the world moving, one rusty pickup or sputtering sedan at a time. But if you looked closer past the grime, you might catch a flicker in his eyes, a weariness that went deeper than just long hours. His day began before most folks considered it morning. 5 a.m. The alarm on his phone, a simple, insistent buzz, cut through the quiet dark of his modest ranch house. He'd swing his feet to the cold floor, the familiar creak of the old boards a comforting sound in the pre-dawn stillness. A quick shower, a mug of black coffee, and a piece of toast wolfed down while Sarah, his wife, and the kids, Lily and Ethan, were still lost in their dreams. Then the worn-out seat of his own truck, the quiet rumble of its engine as he pulled out onto the still dark streets of their small Rust Belt town, the same route he'd driven for 2 decades. The sky would be just starting to bruise purple and gray by the time he pulled into the garage lot, the air thick with the promise of another long day. At the shop, the symphony of clang and hiss, the sharp tang of exhaust and hot metal was as familiar as his own heartbeat. He'd greet the same faces, Frank, Old Man Henderson, the young apprentice still trying to find his footing, with a nod or a grunt. Then it was back to it. Under the hood of a Ford, wrangling a transmission from a Chevy, bleeding brakes on an old Impala. Each job a puzzle, each repair a victory, small as it might be. But the victories never quite added up to enough. Just enough to keep the lights on, keep food on the table, keep the kids in clothes that weren't too far behind the trends. The bills, they stacked up on the kitchen counter like a quiet accusation, a constant reminder that no matter how hard he worked, how many extra hours he pulled, the finish line always seemed to recede just a little further. He wasn't behind, not exactly, but he wasn't ahead either, just treading water in the middle of a vast, unmoving lake. When he finally got home, the fatigue was a heavy cloak. Dinner with Sarah, Lily, and Ethan was usually a quiet affair, punctuated by the kids' stories from school or Sarah's gentle questions about his day. He'd give short answers, too tired to elaborate, his mind already drifting to the couch, to the numb escape of the evening news or whatever game was on. He loved his family fiercely, but sometimes by 7 o'clock he felt like he had nothing left to give, just an empty shell going through the motions until he could collapse into bed and do it all again. It was a cycle, predictable, inescapable, like the turning of a well-oiled crankshaft, except this one was turning him into something less than he knew he could be. And that was the demon that gnawed at him, deep down where no one else could see, a buried fear of stagnation. He saw the same old men in the shop, doing the same old jobs year after year, their dreams long since rusted over. He didn't want to be one of them. Not really. He was meticulous, persistent, committed to doing things right, strengths that could be applied to so much more than just fixing engines. But he was trapped in his own head, paralyzed by the what-ifs and the how-tos. What if he tried something else and failed? How would he even start? He harbored a quiet ambition, a desire to provide more for Sarah, for Lily's budding artistry, for Ethan's boundless energy. He wanted to give them a life with choices, not just necessities. But the thought of stepping out, of risking the steady, meager paycheck was a cold knot in his stomach. He'd watch a car roll out of the garage, purring smoothly, a machine he'd brought back to life, and for a fleeting moment a spark would ignite. I can build things. I can fix things. I understand systems. But then the self-doubt would creep in, insidious as rust. Yeah, but that's just cars, Garrett. That ain't business. That ain't millionaire stuff. That's for guys with fancy degrees or rich daddies. He'd shake his head, push the thought away, and grab the next work order. He knew he complained too much, often grumbling to Sarah about the economy, about how impossible it was to get ahead, about being stuck. But the truth was, he never did anything about it. He worked his hours, then he went home, vegged out, and let the dissatisfaction fester. He blamed the system, the town, his lack of luck. Anything but the quiet complicity of his own inaction. The gap between the man he was and the man he desperately wanted to be was widening, and it felt like a canyon he was too tired, too afraid to bridge. The clang of the garage door closing behind him was usually the sound of freedom, signaling the end of another day spent under engines. Garrett would drive home, the familiar ache in his shoulders a testament to the hours, the grime under his fingernails a badge. But one Tuesday evening it felt different. He walked into his modest ranch house, the air thick with the smell of Sarah's spaghetti sauce, the usual comfort replaced by a subtle unease he couldn't quite place. He dropped his keys on the small table by the door, nodded a tired hello to Sarah, who was stirring a pot, and headed towards the living room where he heard Lily's voice. Lily, his bright, artistic daughter, was on the phone, her voice animated, then suddenly subdued. Garrett paused in the doorway, about to ask her about her day. He heard her laugh, a forced, brittle sound, before she said, "No, I know, I really wish I could too. I saw that summer program at the Art Institute. It looks amazing, right? But yeah, we don't have that kind of money for something like that. Maybe when I'm older after college, if I get a scholarship or something." The words, so casually delivered, hit Garrett with the force of a hydraulic press. "We don't have that kind of money." It wasn't a complaint, not an accusation. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet resignation that twisted something deep inside him. He saw Lily's shoulders slump ever so slightly as she wrapped up her call, heard the faint click as she hung up. He watched her for a moment, her gaze distant, fixed on some unseen point across the room, a dream receding. He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath until he let it out in a slow, ragged sigh. It wasn't just about a summer art program, not really. It was about everything. It was about the way he'd been telling himself for years that his inaction only affected him. He'd convinced himself that his comfort with the status quo, his retreat into the easy chair after work, his endless complaining without concrete steps, was a personal indulgence. But hearing Lily's voice, seeing the flicker of sacrifice in her eyes, shattered that illusion. His stagnation wasn't just his own burden anymore. It was a weight on Lily's dreams. It was a fence around Ethan's future. His own damn habits, the ones he excused as being too tired or not having the time, were the real barrier. Dinner that night was a blur. He chewed his food, tasted nothing. Sarah asked if he was all right. He mumbled something about a long day. Lily and Ethan chattered about school, about their friends, about trivial things, and he just nodded, his mind a roaring echo chamber of "we don't have that kind of money." He looked at Lily across the table, at the nascent artist in her, her hands already sketching in the air as she spoke. He saw the potential, the vibrant colors waiting to burst forth, and he felt a cold dread that his own quiet surrender was dimming her light, one unspoken, unpursued desire at a time. Hours later, the house was silent. Sarah was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. Garrett, however, was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, the glow of the digital alarm clock painting the wall with stark red numbers. 3:17 a.m. He couldn't sleep. Lily's words were etched into the dark corners of his mind, a constant, low thrum of accusation. He slipped out of bed, the floorboards creaking softly under his bare feet, and made his way to the living room. He sat in his worn armchair, the one where he usually zoned out in front of the TV, and for the first time in years, he looked around with brutal honesty. The house was decent, paid for, but it felt small, not in square footage, but in opportunity, like a cage he'd inadvertently built around himself and his family. What had his life become? A meticulous mechanic who could diagnose any engine rattle, but couldn't fix the growing disquiet in his own soul. He saw the years ahead, stretching out like the monotonous highway he drove to work every morning. More of the same. The bills would keep coming, Lily's dreams would keep bumping up against the invisible wall of, "We don't have that kind of money." Ethan would grow up, and Garrett would still be Garrett, just older, more tired, and even more regretful. He thought of all the times he'd complained, all the times he'd blamed luck or the system. He remembered telling Sarah just last week how impossible it was to get ahead in this town. But looking back now, in the unforgiving light of the pre-dawn dark, he saw a pattern of complicity. He hadn't bought the lottery ticket, but he also hadn't bothered to learn how to build his own damn prize. He'd simply sat on the sidelines, criticizing the game while refusing to play. The fear of stagnation, a quiet whisper for years, now screamed in his head. It wasn't just about him being stuck. It was about his kids inheriting his inertia. He saw himself in 20 years, an old man with calloused hands and hollow eyes, looking back at this exact moment and knowing he'd done nothing. Nothing to break the cycle. Nothing to give his children more choices. The thought was a cold, sharp knife twisting in his gut. He was skilled, persistent, responsible, but for what? To maintain the bare minimum. Keep the ship afloat, but never set sail for new horizons. He wrestled with his self-doubt, his analysis paralysis, his constant struggle to ask for help or even admit he needed it. It all came crashing down around him in that quiet, suffocating darkness. His own capabilities, his own potential were gathering dust in the garage of his mind, just like an engine waiting for a spark. He was the barrier. He was the problem. And the shame of it burned hotter than any engine exhaust. It was a Saturday, mid-afternoon, the kind of day already winding down. Garrett was in the garage, wrestling a stubborn tie rod end on a '98 Ford F-150, sweat beaded, mingling with grease. He loved the methodical dance of repair, but today a low hum of anxiety overshadowed the familiar comfort. The truck needed a new transmission, a job he could do, but one that meant a hefty bill for the owner, barely enough profit for him. He thought of Lily's perpetually open sketchbook, Ethan's Lego blueprints. He wanted to provide them with more than just enough. He heard Lily's voice drift in from the backyard, a little louder than usual, her tone bright, then dimming. Something in the shift of her voice snagged his attention. He paused, wrench in hand, head cocked. "But you know," Lily was saying, her words carried clearly on the light breeze, art school's just, it's too much. "We don't have that kind of money, you know." The words hung in the air, light as dust motes in a sunbeam, but they hit Garrett like a piston slamming into soft metal. The wrench slipped from his oily grip, clattering on the concrete floor, a sound far louder than it should have been. "We don't have that kind of money." Lily, his smart, artistic Lily, was dismissing her dream, not because she didn't have the talent, but because she thought he didn't have the money. It wasn't a complaint, not an accusation. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet resignation that twisted something deep inside him. He stood there, frozen, the smell of grease and gasoline suddenly stale, suffocating. His inaction wasn't just affecting him, it was a wall in front of his kids' futures. It was limiting their horizons before they even had a chance to look. That night's sleep was a cruel joke. Garrett lay beside Sarah, the steady rhythm of her breathing a stark contrast to the frantic drumbeat in his own chest. The digital clock on the bedside table glowed 3:17 a.m., then 3:34, then 4:01. Every tick was a hammer blow echoing Lily's words. "We don't have that kind of money." He pulled the blanket up to his chin, but the cold dread was internal. He thought of his modest ranch house, the reliable but aging truck in the driveway, the bills that always seemed to stretch tighter than a fan belt about to snap. He'd always prided himself on being dependable, on providing. But what kind of provision was this? Barely enough to keep the engine running, never enough to leave the driveway. He replayed his days. The alarm, the coffee, the shop, the grind, the coming home, the zoning out in front of the TV until his eyes blurred. He was so damn good at fixing other people's problems, making their machines run, but his own life was sputtering, stuck in neutral. He'd blamed luck, the economy, the hand he was dealt. He'd watched others get ahead, always assuming they had some secret, some unfair advantage. But lying there in the suffocating quiet of his own making, the brutal truth clawed its way to the surface. He wasn't trapped by circumstance. He was trapped by his own damn routine, by the quiet complacency he'd allowed to take root. His constant self-doubt, his inability to push past the comfortable, the familiar. He'd been so afraid of failing, he hadn't even tried to succeed. The thought wasn't just a revelation, it was a hot iron pressed against his soul. He'd been complaining about the lack of progress while actively doing nothing extra to change it. He was the problem. His daily habits were the real barrier, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that if he didn't change, Lily's quiet resignation would become his own. A quiet "enough" formed in the pit of his stomach, not a shout, not a dramatic declaration, just a deep, aching certainty. He didn't know what he was going to do, not yet. He didn't have a plan, a roadmap, or a winning lottery ticket. All he knew was that he couldn't keep doing what he was doing. He couldn't keep going through the motions, letting his potential rust like an old engine block, letting his children think their dreams were too expensive. The cycle had to break, and the only one who could break it was him. It was a raw, primal decision, born not of ambition, but of a quiet, desperate love and a profound, bone-deep fear of stagnation. The next morning, the alarm Garrett had set for 5:00 a.m. felt like a shot to the chest. It was still pitch black outside, the world outside his window wrapped in the deep, cold quiet of pre-dawn. Sarah stirred beside him, murmuring softly as he carefully untangled himself from the sheets. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to hit snooze, to roll over, to sink back into the warmth and familiar comfort of sleep. His mind, the same mind that excelled at diagnosing a tricky engine knock, immediately conjured 1,000 excuses. "You'll be tired at work. What are you even going to do? It's probably pointless anyway." It was the voice of his old self, the one that had kept him trapped, secure in its miserable comfort. But this time Lily's face floated into his mind, the dimming light in her eyes as she spoke of art school. He swallowed hard, the metallic taste of resolve in his mouth. He wouldn't hit snooze, not today. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the cold floorboards ajolt, and stood up. His muscles protested, stiff from yesterday's work, but he pushed through it. He padded silently to the kitchen, the only light coming from the faint glow of the microwave clock. He brewed a pot of coffee, the aroma sharp and real, cutting through the lingering fog of sleep. Then, instead of heading for the worn recliner in the living room, he walked over to the small, dusty corner of the kitchen counter where Sarah kept a few cookbooks. He pulled out a pad of paper and a pen he rarely used, then picked up an old paperback he'd seen gathering dust on a shelf, a book Sarah had bought once about small business. He sat down at the kitchen table, the hardwood cold against his forearms. The first 10 minutes were excruciating. His eyes kept wanting to drift to the window, to the still dark sky. His mind felt like a seized engine, gears grinding against each other. He didn't know where to start, what to read, what to write. He just sat there, coffee cooling, the words on the page blurring. This was the boring stuff, the uncomfortable actions that nobody else saw, nobody else did. This was the real barrier, not some grand financial scheme, but the simple, brute force of showing up and trying. He read a paragraph, then another. He skimmed a chapter on budgeting, then tried to write down 3 things he wanted to accomplish at the shop that day, beyond just the scheduled repairs. Felt awkward, foolish, like a kid trying to fix a complex machine with a toy wrench. But he stayed. He didn't give up. He just kept turning the page, kept scribbling notes, kept trying to make his brain engage. When the faint gray light of dawn finally began to creep through the window, signaling it was time to get ready for work, an hour had passed. He hadn't felt a sudden surge of genius, no bolts of lightning. Just a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. He had done it. He had done the thing he almost didn't do. The next morning, the alarm felt like a punch to the gut. Garrett lay there, eyes squeezed shut, the pillow smelling faintly of old sweat and regret. His body screamed for more sleep. His mind, still groggy from the previous day's unaccustomed effort, whispered excuses. Just 5 more minutes. What's one day? You didn't accomplish anything yesterday anyway. Temptation to just roll over, to let the familiar comfort of inaction swallow him whole, was a heavy blanket. It felt easier, safer, like sinking back into the soft mud of routine he'd always known. But then Lily's voice echoed in his head, soft but sharp like a sliver of glass. "We don't have that kind of money." He saw her face, the quiet resignation in her eyes, and something hardened in his gut. He swung his legs out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath his bare feet. Each movement felt like pushing against an invisible wall. The coffee was bitter this morning, the words on the page even blurrier than the day before. He caught himself staring into space more often, the business book a dead weight in his hands. He felt a dull ache behind his eyes, a weariness that went deeper than just lack of sleep. This wasn't a sprint. It was a slow, grinding crawl up a hill he couldn't even see the top of. Day 3 brought a new kind of exhaustion. He was short-tempered with Ethan at breakfast, snapped at a slow-moving customer at the shop. Sarah asked if he was feeling all right, her brow furrowed with concern. He just grunted, "Fine." He felt like he was slogging through mud all day, his movements slower, his mind less sharp. When he finally got home, all he wanted was to crash on the couch, forget the damn book, forget the early mornings. He saw the dim light of the kitchen table, a beacon of what he should do, and his whole body rebelled. He almost did it, almost just walked past it, straight to the TV. But he thought of that quiet ambition, that nagging fear of stagnation, and with a sigh that felt like it came from his very bones, he pushed himself towards the table. The silence of the house before dawn was heavy with his struggle. By day 7, the novelty had vanished completely. There was no little pat on the back, no surge of inspiration, just the relentless, boring discipline of getting up. He started trying to sketch out a plan for fixing up old lawnmowers on the side, but the numbers didn't quite add up, or he couldn't find parts cheaply enough. He'd read a chapter on marketing and felt completely lost. He felt like a fool, like he was playing at being a businessman, an imposter in his own kitchen. The old self-doubt gnawed at him, loud and insistent. "See, you're not cut out for this. You're a mechanic, that's it. Stick to what you know." One morning, a particularly tough repair had kept him late the night before, and the alarm felt like an attack. He silenced it, just for a moment, then another, and then found himself drifting back into a heavy sleep. He woke up 30 minutes later in a cold sweat, a knot of guilt tightening in his stomach. He'd failed. He'd skipped. The whole damn thing was a waste. He dragged himself to the kitchen. The coffee tasted like ash. The book felt like a judgment. He stared at the pages, unable to focus. But he didn't go back to bed. He stayed there, just sat in the uncomfortable silence, the failure burning in his chest. And then slowly a different thought pushed its way through the fog. "You messed up. So what? Are you going to quit?" His jaw tightened. No, not this time. He might have lost a battle, but he wasn't going to lose the war. He opened the book, forced his eyes to the first line, and started again. It was harder after the stumble, a fresh reminder of how easy it was to fall back. But it was also a reminder that getting back up was a choice, one he was damn well going to keep making. This wasn't about being perfect, it was about being persistent. It was about showing up even when every fiber of his being screamed to quit. And most days he did. He showed up. He read. He scribbled. He learned to live with the constant hum of wanting to give up because the alternative was worse. Days bled into weeks. The 5 a.m. alarm, once a tormentor, became a familiar, if still unwelcome, companion. Garrett no longer cursed its existence. He just answered its call. He'd sit there in the dim kitchen, the only sound the hum of the fridge and the turning pages of a book, sometimes a legal pad scraping under his pen. It wasn't a sudden burst of genius or a miraculous awakening. It was just showing up. Every damn day, even after the stumble, even when the words blurred, even when the old doubts whispered like ghosts in the corners of his mind, telling him it was all for nothing. He just kept showing up. Then somewhere around the 4-week mark, something started to shift. It wasn't a seismic jolt. It was more like the slow, steady turning of a rusted gear. Sarah was the first to notice. She'd always woken up to the smell of his coffee, but now she'd see him already dressed for work, engrossed in a book. One morning, she leaned against the doorframe, sipping her own mug. "You look different, Gar." She wasn't smiling, just observing, her brow furrowed with a mixture of curiosity and a hint of concern. "Less heavy." Garrett looked up, a faint flush spreading across his neck. "Just been getting up earlier, honey, trying to get a head start." He didn't want to explain the whole thing, the fear, the desperation, the quiet war he was fighting. Not yet, but her words resonated. He did feel lighter somehow. The weight hadn't vanished, but he was carrying it differently, with stronger shoulders. He started applying some of what he was reading. A book on lean manufacturing meant for factories gave him ideas for his garage. He reorganized his toolbox, streamlined the parts ordering process, even found a way to cut down on wasted shop towels. Small stuff, almost invisible to the naked eye, but it shaved minutes off each job, adding up to an extra hour or two a week he could dedicate to more complex, higher-paying repairs, or, increasingly, to his side projects. Those side projects, born out of evenings and weekends, were starting to hum. He'd taken on a few small engine repairs for neighbors, lawnmowers, tillers, even an old outboard motor. Word of mouth spread. Garrett's meticulous attention to detail, a trait he'd always applied to his professional work, now extended to these private gigs. He wasn't just fixing things, he was making them run better than new. The first few checks he deposited felt almost illicit, money earned outside the usual grind, money that wasn't already earmarked for bills. He set up a separate savings account for it, a small, quiet rebellion against the endless cycle. Lily started to notice too. She'd come into the garage on a Saturday, expecting to find her dad watching a game, and instead see him hunched over a sputtering generator, a schematic spread out beside him, focused, energized. "What are you doing, Dad?" She'd ask, not with the usual teenage disinterest, but with genuine wonder. He'd explain patiently about currents and carburetors, about finding the fault and making it right. He even started showing her how to sketch parts, explaining the engineering behind them, noticing the flicker of interest in her artistic eye. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a man building something. He was a man with a plan. The self-doubt hadn't completely packed its bags and left town. It still showed up unannounced, usually around 2 a.m., whispering its old familiar tune. But now, Garrett had an answer for it. He had the quiet confidence of consistent action. He had the evidence in the form of a steadily growing side hustle account, in the new tools he'd bought with those profits, in the way he could tackle a tricky problem at work with a fresh perspective. He wasn't just hoping for a different future. He was actively, painstakingly creating it, one wrench turn and one page turn at a time. The fear of stagnation, once a paralyzing weight, now felt like a motor humming quietly, pushing him forward. He was still Garrett, the mechanic, but the man inside was waking up. He was seeing possibilities where he'd only seen walls. He was learning to trust himself, not just his hands, but his mind, his discipline, and his stubborn refusal to give up. He was building his damn lottery ticket. The hum of the motor wasn't just in his garage anymore. It was in Garrett. Sarah noticed it first, not in big declarations, but in the quiet moments. He'd come home from work, still tired, sure, but the slump in his shoulders was less pronounced. He'd still eat dinner, watch a bit of TV, but his gaze wasn't vacant. More often now, he'd pull out a notebook, scribbling diagrams or calculations, sometimes a new idea for a small engine repair he could take on the side. He started talking about the future in a way that wasn't just complaining, but planning. What if we could? He'd ask Sarah instead of, "We can't because." One evening, as he was about to grumble about a tricky job at the shop, he caught himself, took a breath, and instead started outlining how he'd approach it differently next time. The air in their modest ranch house, once thick with unspoken resignation, slowly began to thin, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. Sarah hadn't dared to articulate it, not yet, but she felt it in the way Garrett held himself, in the subtle shifts in his daily routine. He still crashed on the couch after dinner sometimes, exhausted from a long day under a hoist, but his eyes would snap open a little quicker, a new focus replacing the old, distant stare. He'd reach for that dog-eared business book, a worn copy of the E-Myth Revisited, or something about small engine repair he'd ordered online, highlighting passages with a blunt pencil. "What's got you so absorbed tonight, hun?" she'd ask, watching him from her armchair, a knitting project resting idly in her lap. She was careful with her tone, not wanting to spook this new, budding version of him. Garrett would lower the book, a faint blush rising on his weathered cheeks. "Just thinking about how I could do things different. This fella in the book, he talks about systems. Makes sense, you know. Like if I had a system for logging my side jobs, for ordering parts, for even just sending out a simple invoice, it wouldn't feel so much like just winging it every time." He'd gesture vaguely with his hand, as if trying to grasp an invisible concept in the air between them. "Right now, it's all in my head, and that's fine for a quick fix, but for something bigger, it's a mess." Sarah would nod, a small smile playing on her lips. "Sounds like a good idea, less stress for you too." She wasn't just being supportive, she genuinely believed him. The old Garrett would have scoffed at a system, dismissing it as fancy talk for something unnecessary. The new Garrett saw it as another piece of his slowly assembling lottery ticket. He started keeping a small, leather-bound notebook, a gift from Lily a few Christmases ago that had sat unused, dedicated solely to his side work. In it, meticulous entries appeared. Sat, Mr. Henderson carb rebuild for mower, parts, $32, labor, 2 HRS at 60/HR, total, $152, net profit. $120, new spark plugs order from AutoZone. It wasn't glamorous, it was tedious, it was exactly the boring stuff he talked about. But each entry, each calculation was a tiny deposit into his future, a concrete step away from stagnation. He even started using a cheap spreadsheet program on their old desktop computer, slowly pecking out entries, groaning occasionally at the unfamiliar technology, but always persisting. Lily and Ethan noticed too. Their dad, who used to spend his early mornings hunched over coffee and the local paper, was now often in the garage, the faint smell of oil and solvent drifting through the house. Or he was at the kitchen table, a textbook open next to his cereal bowl, a pen scratching quietly. One Saturday morning, Ethan, usually glued to his video games, peered into the garage where Garrett was meticulously cleaning and organizing his tools. "What are you doing, Dad?" he asked, kicking at a loose pebble on the concrete floor. Garrett looked up, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Just getting things in order. A tidy shop is an efficient shop. You know, less time looking for a 10mm socket means more time getting the job done right." He held up a wrench. "Every tool has its place, and when it's not in its place, it's wasted time. Wasted time is wasted money, son." Ethan, surprisingly, didn't immediately wander off. He watched Garrett methodically arranging socket sets, hanging wrenches on pegboards, sweeping the floor. There was a quiet intensity to his dad, a focused energy that was new. It wasn't the frantic energy of someone rushing, but the deliberate motion of someone building. "Can I help?" he asked, almost hesitantly. Garrett paused, a small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Sure, kiddo. Grab that broom over there. Let's get this place spotless." That afternoon, while Garrett was out picking up parts for a snowblower engine he was rebuilding, Lily found his leather notebook on the kitchen counter. Her artistic eye was drawn to the neat columns, the handwritten notes. She saw the entries, the profit margins, the careful planning. It wasn't poetry, but it had its own kind of structured beauty. She saw an entry for Lily's art supplies, $45. He hadn't mentioned it. He just quietly bought them for her the previous week, a new set of expensive colored pencils she'd only dreamed about. A warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just about the pencils. It was the silent message behind them, the evidence of her dad's relentless, quiet effort. He wasn't just talking about dreams anymore. He was tangibly working towards them for all of them. The self-doubt still gnawed at Garrett, of course. Especially late at night, after a long day at the shop and another hour or two in the garage. His mind would conjure up all the reasons he couldn't succeed. Not smart enough, too old to start, too much competition. He'd stare at the numbers in his ledger, feeling the weight of the mortgage, the growing cost of Lily's art supplies, Ethan's future college, the fear of failing all of them. It was a cold, gripping fear that made his stomach clench. But then he'd remember Lily's voice, the trigger. He'd remember the shame and the fierce surge of determination that had followed. He wasn't doing this for immediate gratification or for recognition. He was doing it for the look on Lily's face when she opened that package of pencils, for the quiet pride when Ethan asked to help, for the peaceful smile on Sarah's face when he talked about, "What if we could?" with genuine hope in his voice. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a provider, a protector, a builder. And building, he was learning, was often slow, tedious, and filled with doubt. But it was also the only way to get anywhere worthwhile. He'd take a deep breath, push the self-doubt aside, and pick up his book again, or jot down another idea in his notebook. He knew it wasn't about some secret formula or being smart, as he often told himself. It was about doing the boring stuff day in, day out, when no one's watching. Most folks want to hit the lottery. He just figured out how to build his own damn lottery ticket, one small step at a time. And yeah, it ain't always fun, but neither is being broke. He closed his eyes, picturing the quiet hum of his nascent business, the methodical clicking of his old computer, the scent of fresh oil and newly turned pages. He was still Garrett the mechanic, but the man inside was wide awake, charting a new course not just for himself, but for the life he was painstakingly creating for his family, one uncomfortable, disciplined action after another.